The Academic Freedom Lecture Fund invites you to view the University of Michigan Senate's 19th Annual Davis Markert Nickerson Lecture on Academic and Intellectual Freedom. The lecture was held on November 9, 2009, in the Honigman Auditorium of the University of Michigan Law School on the campus of the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, Michigan. The lecturer is Philip Hamburger, Maurice and Hilda Friedman Professor of Law at the Columbia University Law School. The title of his lecture is Galileo's Ghost, 17th Century Censorship in 21st Century America. Introductory comments will be made by Peggy J. Hollingsworth, President of the Academic Freedom Lecture Fund.
On behalf of the Academic Freedom Lecture Fund, I would like to welcome you to the 19th Annual University of Michigan Senate's Davis Markert Nickerson Lecture on Academic and Intellectual Freedom. The intention of the Senate Assembly when it established this lecture series in 1990 was that the annual lecture would be a constant reminder of the value and vulnerability of academic and intellectual freedom. This concern, stated during the first lecture delivered by Robert M. O'Neill in early 1991, has been reiterated at every lecture since that time. As in nearly every year since it became the lecture series, H. Chandler Davis, Emeritus Professor of Mathematics from the University of Toronto, and a surviving member of our three honorees after whom we named this lecture, has joined us for the annual lecture. Chandler is not only a distinguished mathematician, but also a talented poet and essayist. Chandler, would you please stand so that we can recognize you? Shortly after the University of Michigan Senate Assembly established its annual lecture, the Senate Assembly created the Academic Freedom Lecture Fund. The fund has an advisory board comprised of distinguished scholars and leading authorities on First Amendment rights. Members of the fund's advisory board have a central role in maintaining and enhancing the quality of the annual lecture that goes beyond the raising of necessary funds. They often suggest the names of scholars who will be selected to deliver the lecture and some help to persuade an individual, once selected, to accept our invitation to give the lecture. A number of the members of the advisory board are former lecturers. The primary source of funding for the annual lecture comes from those members of our community who donate each year to the fund. Because of the current economic recession, the contributions that you make to support this lecture series today are more critical than at any time in the 19-year history of the lecture series. Almost to the exact date, 5 years ago, a social psychologist and writer from California, Carol Tavris, delivered a lecture at the University of Michigan entitled Pills, Profits, Sex, and Science: The Erosion of Academic Freedom in the Corporate Age. This lecture was sponsored by the local chapters of the American Association of University Professors and Sigma Psi, the Scientific Research Society, as well as by the Academic Freedom Lecture Fund, the Center for the Education of Women, and the Institute for Research on Women and Gender. In her lecture, Dr. Tavris discussed what she considered a particularly egregious abuse of academic freedom by an institutional review board at the University of Michigan. This year's lecture will continue the discussion of the issues raised by Dr. Tavris, issues that are or should be of major concern to all who conduct scholarly research. The federally mandated regulation of research at major universities, such as ours, poses interesting and provocative questions with respect to academic and intellectual freedom and to the First Amendment of the United States Constitution. As the Faculty Senate's annual lecture has moved to fill a central role in the university's academic year, public interest in the lecture has grown immensely. For many years, the university's public television station, Channel 22, has rebroadcast this lecture repeatedly during the months that follow. Thus, your friends, colleagues, and students who are not here today will have opportunities to hear this important lecture by Professor Hamburger. Many are responsible for the success of this lecture. I would like to thank members of the Faculty Senate Office, its Director, Thomas Schneider, and especially Linda Carr, for their efforts in assisting to organize this year's lecture. Scott Mann and his colleagues from Michigan Productions are here again this year to record the lecture that we subsequently will be able to see on Channel 22. For the 9th year, Brent Futrell has created an impressive poster to advertise the lecture. Namita Joseph, an undergraduate student in the College of Literature, Science, and the Arts. Catherine Nielsen, a graduate student in public policy and the law school. Anna Rosas, a graduate student in the School of Information, and Karen Teskey, a graduate student in the School of Public Health, have distributed the posters across this campus. I am delighted that Provost Teresa Sullivan is here today to introduce our speaker. Provost Sullivan.
Well, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to join Michael and Peggy in welcoming you to the 2009 Davis Markert Nickerson Lecture. I also want to recognize Dr. Davis, who's here this afternoon. I commend him for his courage during the McCarthy era, when he challenged those who would limit our right to think, to speak, and to freely associate with people who hold unconventional or non-conforming ideas. The Davis Markert Nickerson Lecture, held each year, is an important event on the university's calendar. It is a time we set aside for thinking about academic and intellectual freedom, core values for our campus and for higher education. In its 19-year history, this lecture series has explored significant challenges to academic freedom, including limits on free speech, the response to terrorism, and the role of technology. Each lecture has offered an opportunity to examine what the Senate Assembly described as fundamental values for a university in a free society when it established the lecture in 1990. As a community, we're indebted to the Senate Assembly for this opportunity. We thank the Assembly and the individuals who've helped to support today's lecture. Professors Davis, Markert, and Nickerson took their actions in defense of academic freedom in defiance of congressional inquiries in 1954. Most of the population alive today in the United States, about 60%, had not yet been born. Another 15% were aged 10 or younger and perhaps not following the news. So for many, it's hard to imagine the McCarthy era and the limits on freedom of thought, speech, and association that it brought. The histories of these faculty members offer us a glimpse into this difficult time. In 1954, university faculty members Chandler Davis, Clement Markert, and Mark Nickerson were summoned to testify before the House Un-American Activities Committee, known as HUAC. Choosing to test the constitutionality of that committee, each of them refused to testify about their political activities. These were courageous acts at a difficult time in our nation's history. Dr. Davis, a mathematician, was educated at Harvard. He taught math here from 1950 to 1954. When called to testify before HUAC, he invoked the Fifth Amendment protection against self-incrimination and refused to testify. Dr. Davis was suspended from the university as a result. His department, math, and his college, LS&A, supported his reinstatement, but the faculty senate did not, and he was dismissed from the university. Dr. Davis was also cited for contempt of Congress, indicted in 1954 and convicted in 1957. He appealed to the courts but was unsuccessful. He served a sentence in federal prison in 1960. Since 1962, Dr. Davis has been a member of the faculty at the University of Toronto. He has had a distinguished career in mathematics and also as a writer of science fiction. Currently, he is Professor Emeritus at the University of Toronto. Clement Markert, who passed away in 1999, had an impressive career as a biologist. After earning his PhD from Johns Hopkins University, he began a faculty career here as assistant professor of zoology. Like Dr. Davis, he was summoned by HUAC, and he too invoked his Fifth Amendment rights. He was suspended by the university, but later reinstated with the support of the biology department, LS&A, and the faculty senate, and he went on to receive tenure here. Dr. Markert later chaired the Department of Biology at Yale, was elected to the National Academy of Sciences, and was president of the American Institute of Biological Sciences. He concluded his career as Distinguished University Research Professor at North Carolina State University. Mark Nickerson, who died in 1998, made major contributions to the field of pharmacology. Holding both a PhD from Johns Hopkins and an MD from the University of Utah, Dr. Nickerson was an associate professor with tenure here when he was summoned to appear before HUAC. Like his colleagues, he invoked his Fifth Amendment rights in response to questions from the committee. Dr. Nickerson was immediately suspended from the university. Although the Faculty Senate supported his reinstatement, his department and the medical school did not, and he was dismissed despite having tenure. Dr. Nickerson went on to serve as professor of pharmacology and therapeutics at McGill University, chairing the department there. The author of more than 250 publications, he served as president of the Pharmacological Society of Canada and the American Society for Pharmacology and Experimental Therapeutics. These three individuals demonstrated great integrity. Their commitment to important principles of academic and democratic life stands before us as a model. We're among the many beneficiaries of their actions, and thus we have a deep and sobering responsibility to defend academic and intellectual freedom. Today's lecture is our public recognition of that responsibility. We're honored to have Professor Philip Hamburger here today to continue our tradition of thoughtful exploration of difficult questions related to intellectual and academic freedom. Dr. Hamburger is the Maurice and Hilda Friedman Professor of Law at Columbia University School of Law. His scholarly work covers fields from censorship to contracts and focuses on constitutional law and its history. Very much in the spirit of our gathering today, Dr. Hamburger's work challenges conventional thinking and offers non-conforming ideas that encourage readers to examine their own understanding of history. His 2002 book, Separation of Church and State, argues that the American emphasis on separation was reinforced and magnified by fear and prejudice, particularly fear of the Catholic Church on the part of Protestants. His most recent book, Law and Judicial Review, is an examination of how the practice of judicial review developed in the United States. And in this book as well, conventional understandings are challenged. Dr. Hamburger is a graduate of Princeton University and the Yale University Law School. He served on the law faculty of the University of Connecticut, George Washington University, and the University of Chicago before accepting his current position at Columbia. He has also served as a distinguished visiting professor at the University of Virginia and Northwestern University Law Schools. Dr. Hamburger's talk this afternoon is titled Galileo's Ghost, 17th Century Censorship in 21st Century America. It is a pleasure to welcome him to our lectern as the 19th Davis Markert Nickerson Lecture.
Well, thank you. It's a great honor to be here. My title today is Galileo's Ghost, 17th Century Censorship in 21st Century America. We Americans like to think we enjoy freedom of speech in the press. We like to think we can publish and speak with the full protection of the First Amendment. But faculty and students, including faculty and students right here at Michigan, no longer really enjoy this freedom because there's been a revival of licensing of speech and the press. And as a result, faculty and students, including here at Michigan, need prior permission or a license before speaking or publishing. The last time this sort of censorship flourished was, unbelievably, in the 17th century, that long ago. Back then, if you wrote a book, you needed a license or permission before you could publish. The Inquisition imposed this in Italy, and the Star Chamber imposed it in England. Even if you merely wanted to speak, you might need a license. For example, in Shakespeare's time, you needed a license before actors could perform on stage and recite a play. And it's usually assumed that all of this licensing, this pre-publication censorship, this licensing ended by the 18th century, that it was a 16th, 17th century phenomenon, and now it's gone by the 18th century. And it was barred in America by the First Amendment. But today it has returned. Today, many individuals, again, need permission for the mere use of language. Licensing of speech in the press is very different from a driver's license. Right? A driver's license is how most of us are familiar with licensing. Before you drive, you need a license. Now imagine you need the same thing for speaking or publishing. Imagine you needed permission from the government determining that you are sufficiently responsible to speak or publish. But that's not all. Imagine that you needed permission each time you spoke or published. See, at least after you get a driver's license, you can drive where you please, right? You get a driver's license, you can drive to Illinois, you can drive to Michigan, you can drive anywhere you want. But imagine that you needed prior permission not merely once, but every time you spoke or published. You would need permission to begin a conversation. You would need permission to ask each question. You would need permission to publish the answer. This is the sort of censorship that has come back to life. It was once done by the Inquisition in the Star Chamber, and it now flourishes in American universities, including right here at Michigan. The revival of licensing depends and touches on all sorts of deeper questions. Much deeper questions, I confess, than a mere law professor really knows how to handle. So I need the assistance of some friends, some very old friends, and you probably know them, Socrates and Galileo. Now, of course, only their ghosts can join us, and it therefore will be very difficult for us to see, let alone hear them. But please imagine them right up here on stage with me, so just a little bit behind me, as if they were a Greek chorus. In this case, of course, a silent Greek chorus. In ancient Greek plays, the chorus provided commentary on the drama. And in this talk, I want Socrates and Galileo to be my Greek chorus. So as the talk progresses, don't just listen to me. There's no reason why you should believe anything simply because I said it. That's what free speech is all about. We make our own judgments as to what to believe and what to say. In the back of your mind, therefore, even as I'm talking, ask yourself always, what would Socrates and Galileo have to say about the subject we discussed today? How would they view the revival of licensing? Let's start with Socrates, the founder of the original academy. Socrates spent his life empirically testing an hypothesis stated by the oracle at Delphi, right? The oracle declared that no one was wiser than Socrates. And rather than accept this as true, Socrates, being a good academic, set out to prove it wrong by questioning his contemporaries. And so his efforts were a sort of empirical inquiry to test an hypothesis about himself and, by extension, human nature. They were his human subjects. And when he showed them up as phonies and frauds, they felt anxiety and shame, and rightly so. Socrates understood that questions that cut deep necessarily cause discomfort. And the deeper the question, the greater the discomfort. And so it's precisely by causing internal pain that a serious question can force an individual to see herself and the world differently. And it's precisely by redirecting social stigma that a serious question can educate a society about its values. And we will see shortly that universities today impose censorship to prevent academics from asking questions that cause emotional distress or social stigma. But as Socrates recognized, questions that cause anxiety and scorn are the very foundations of moral and philosophic inquiry. Now, because of his questioning, Socrates was punished by the demos. In other words, by the populace. Had he put his questions to himself, he would have been left alone. But he posed his questions to others, his human subjects, and thereby called into doubt, it was said, the gods of the city. As we would put it, he called into doubt national pieties. And Socrates was therefore prosecuted before a jury and condemned to drink hemlock. But at least he was punished only after the fact, not beforehand, right? He was not asked to get a license, to get permission before asking questions. And his student Plato was able to publish the resulting dialogues without getting permission. So Socrates would have had much to say about licensing of speech in the press, but he himself did not experience it. Well, in contrast, Galileo was subjected to licensing. Whereas Socrates was able to ask questions and share his views before being censored, Galileo had to get permission beforehand, before publication. So Galileo, as we all know, argued that the Earth rotated around the sun, and this was unacceptable to the clerics who oversaw the Inquisition. And one of them, very kindly, even warned him ahead of time that his work was unsuitable for publication and he shouldn't publish it. Saved him some trouble and also made sure it didn't get published. But of course, Galileo wanted to publish, and he knew he first needed a license. So what did he do? In 1632, he quietly obtained a license from a cleric who did not know that Galileo had been warned not to publish. And so although Galileo thereby got past the Inquisition was not amused. It could not proceed against him for failing to get a license. He had one. But it imprisoned him for failing to make adequate disclosure to the licensor that, in fact, it was forbidden material. Now, we should be very clear, the Inquisition was not entirely evil. On the contrary, the Inquisition was run by educated, intelligent men, and many of them were deeply interested in science. But they thought they were doing God's work, and to this end, they licensed and imprisoned Galileo. So Socrates and Galileo are my Greek chorus. Not the chorus of the demos, the populace, but a chorus of intellectuals. And don't worry that you can't hear them. You don't have to. As we explore the revival of licensing, you can just imagine what they would say. Okay, so let's explore the modern licensing of speech in the press. Let's see how the 17th century has come back to life. The contemporary licensing of speech in the press is that implemented by institutional review boards, what are sometimes known as IRBs. These boards or committees exist at every university in the country, and they license a large swath of academic inquiry. The modern licensing system has a hierarchy, just like the Inquisition and the Church. And this hierarchy exists in 4 layers. And what I want to do today is begin by just examining this hierarchy, this institutional review board structure, from top to bottom. First, the government. Second, the universities. Third, institutional review boards or IRBs themselves. And fourth, at the bottom, faculty and students who have to bear the weight of all of this. So, first, at the top of the hierarchy is the government, especially the federal government. The government fears that research on human beings causes them harm, and it therefore uses IRBs, the institutional review boards, to oversee this research. Now, incidentally, the government also uses IRBs to protect human subjects in more specialized circumstances. For example, to review FDA drug trials. But the specialized use of IRBs for the FDA is not what I want to talk about today. Yes? Oh, you can't hear me. How's that? Good. How's that? Very good. Thank you. So it's the specialized use of the FDA, of IRBs by the FDA is interesting, it's important, but it's not my focus today. Instead, the concern here is the broader imposition of licensing on academia. Under laws and regulations that, just for convenience, I'm going to call the IRB laws, licensing is posed generally on academics who do human subjects research. Now, the federal government does not directly carry out the licensing, but instead it asks the universities to do it. In a free society, it is difficult for government directly to impose licensing of speech in the press. And that's incidentally why the Star Chamber in the 17th century required universities to impose the licensing. And again, not surprisingly, when the government wants to impose licensing of speech in the press, it turns to the universities to help carry it out for it. The government sets standards for the licensing in a regulation known as the Common Rule. It's so called because many government departments and agencies have adopted the same rule, and it sets the minimum standard for the licensing. The government imposes the licensing on universities in three ways. First, the government makes licensing a condition of its grants to universities and other research institutions. In other words, when a university such as Michigan receives federal money, it has to accept the license together with the money, the licensing system together with money. Second, and increasingly more important, the federal government relies on negligence law, state negligence law. The federal government has inculcated the understanding that a university would violate its duty of care if it did not impose the licensing. And then finally, third, many states have adopted statutes that directly require the IRBs to be imposed by universities. So we have three mechanisms by which the federal government imposes this on universities. What's the second layer? The second layer of the hierarchy are the universities themselves. And the universities uniformly cooperate with the federal government by establishing IRBs and then requiring submission by all their personnel to the licensing run by the IRBs. Now, how do universities force faculty and students to submit? Well, it's quite simple. They threaten what are sometimes very candidly called serious consequences. What are serious consequences? We all know what those are, and sometimes it's made quite explicit. Students will be expelled and faculty will be dismissed. And if you don't believe it, try it, and you'll see what happens. So that's what the universities do. They just do the bidding of the government here. And then at the third level, we have the IRBs, the institutional review boards themselves. And we need to linger on these IRBs so as to understand them. These boards consist of faculty, administrators, and at least one community member. At some universities, actually, they conveniently choose a policeman as the community member, and you can imagine where that leads. All have to be chosen by federal regulation for their sensitivity to community standards. That's what you have overseeing academic work. The jurisdiction of IRBs, as defined by the Common Rule, is over all human subjects research. A human subject is defined as, and forgive me, I'm going to read part of a federal regulation. It's very tedious. Just feel sorry for lawyers as I read this. A human subject is defined as a living individual about whom an investigator conducting research obtains, first, data through intervention or interaction with the individual, or, second, identifiable private information. In other words, a human subject is defined in terms of data and information. This reveals already the real focus of IRBs, which is not harm, but about acquisition and sharing of knowledge. Now, what's the definition of research? Because it's human subjects research that's the jurisdiction of IRBs. The definition of research also reveals the focus of licensing and speech in the press. The Common Rule defines research as a systematic investigation designed to produce generalizable knowledge. Generalizable knowledge. This definition self-consciously follows the scientific model of research, in which a researcher seeks the sort of knowledge that can be generalized as an hypothesis or theory. That's generalizable knowledge. And in this understanding of research, theories must be published so other scholars can test them. Right? The modern theory of science, since Francis Bacon worked on this 400 years ago, is you do empirical study, you develop a theory, you publish it, and then other people can study and criticize the theory. IRBs, therefore, widely believe, and government reports acknowledge this, that they must license not just any research, but that which the researcher plans to publish or which is publishable. So, for example, the Michigan IRBs state that, and I'm quoting, publication is an indicator of generalizable knowledge. Publication is an indicator of generalizable knowledge. So research is defined really as the precursor to publication, an attempt to formulate a publishable theory using scientific style method. This definition of research makes IRB licensing both perversely narrow and perversely broad. And this confirms the focus on publication. On the one hand, the definition of research is strangely narrow, because IRBs don't license all physical interventions. They only license physical interventions that will generate a theory, that is, a publishable result. On the other hand, the definition is strangely broad. IRBs license all sorts of merely verbal inquiry. In other words, when scholars simply read or talk or publish. And they do so not because the activities are particularly dangerous. Most reading, talking, publication doesn't seem to me that frightening. But because they will generate a theory. In other words, again, a publishable result. So IRBs thus exercise power not over harmful conduct. That's just an illusion. It has nothing to do with harmful conduct. If you look at the jurisdiction of IRBs, they take power over inquiry with an intent to develop a publishable theory. And this is right in the regulations themselves. So the result is bizarre and all about publication. An academic needs no permission for genuinely dangerous research if she is not aiming at a theory or publication. But she needs publication for harmless words, talking, reading, and writing, if she's aiming at a theory or publication. It's astonishing. Now, what happens when you ask for permission? When you ask for permission, the IRB decides what you can say and what you can publish. It can bluntly forbid you from talking to human subjects. In other words, if I want to talk to you to learn something, I can be forbidden. It can forbid you from reading about them. In other words, reading about live people brings you within IRB jurisdiction. Or merely observing them, just using your eyes, not opening your mouth. Or publishing about them, i.e. sharing information. All of this can be barred. If you merely want to read public records, such as court documents or public census data, the IRB can limit what you read and what you publish. And they do this actually quite frequently. They do not want you to take intensive study of census data if you're going to learn about anyone in particular. The IRB can also directly modify your research. It can rewrite your questions. It can adjust your scientific method. And incidentally, if you're in a complex scientific specialty, imagine having your department rewrite your methods if you take a dissenting point of view. Now imagine not your department, but people who are not even in your field, having an English professor rewrite your scientific methods if you're in statistics or biochemistry, or a community member. They can rewrite your scientific method, and often they downgrade the quality of the method. That's the usual story, unfortunately. Now, the Inquisition inked over or rewrote forbidden passages in book manuscripts. The censors went through, and they just scrawled out the discussions they disapproved of, or rewrote them. And there are even some published books, which once they got published, the Inquisition realized, we forgot to get that passage, so those get inked out by the printer. IRBs do exactly the same thing today, literally the same thing, with questions and barring results being published. In addition, an IRB can prevent you from publishing or even learning the identity of persons from whom or about whom you get information, even if just by reading, let alone talking. Most typically, though, IRBs will delay approval if they don't like what you're doing to get you to self-censor. And this is what the Supreme Court calls a chilling effect. Because if you learn the IRB rules sufficiently and they keep on saying no, they don't have to ink it out for you. You'll get the hint and just drop that part of your research. The standard of review is both vague and stifling. IRBs weigh the risks and the benefits of research. But the government acknowledges that the determinations of risk and benefit are subjective. The government even expects IRBs to take into account, and I'm quoting, prevailing community standards, what Socrates would recognize as the demands of the demos. The risks that IRBs prevent include all the benefits of freedom of speech. IRBs are expected to press, inquiry and publication to avoid the risks of, and by the way, this isn't a satire, these are quotations. They're expected to avoid the risks of legal harm, financial harm, moral harm, whatever that is, social stigma, mental upset. Gee, IRB members haven't spent enough time with lawyers. They're even meant to prevent the harms of mere worry. But of course, these are the benefits of research and publication in many instances, right? So, for example, I used to study the Ku Klux Klan. It was by accident, but I ended up studying the Ku Klux Klan. And I worked in the Klan out of just intellectual curiosity. But you know something? I wouldn't have wept if my research had caused Klan members legal or financial harm. It wouldn't have caused me deep remorse if it had caused them social stigma or worry, right? Some risks are benefits, but the IRBs don't get this. So thus far, we've seen three layers in the hierarchy of licensing. We've seen first, the government has a role in imposing it. Second, the universities carry out the government's bidding. And third, the IRBs are the instruments which by the universities license speech in the press. And of course, we still have one step to go. We have a fourth layer to this hierarchy, the individuals who hope to learn and publish. That's all of us, I hope. And we might be forgiven, though, for forgetting them, because they're really at the bottom of the pile. Scholars fear the IRBs. Fear is the key word here. And they therefore retreat from inquiry and publication that might annoy their IRBs. And as a result, much important inquiry is never even begun, let alone published. This is, by the way, a standard complaint among scholars. I'll just give one example. A distinguished scholar of journalism, Margaret Blanchard, abandoned her work on contemporary issues. She explained, "I'm leaving the contemporary period behind because it is much safer in the 19th century. Only living persons are human subjects, and therefore you do not have to worry about the IRB when you work in the 19th century." She adds, "I've seen students alter research projects to avoid IRB contact. I've heard words such as thought control used far too often." And she concludes, "A better formula for stultifying research is beyond contemplation." That's just one commentary from one distinguished professor, but I think it gives you some of the flavor. Academics are so scared that they're afraid even openly to complain about the IRB system. They mutter privately. People will come up to me at conferences and will call me to tell me about it. But then they say, "But don't mention my name. Don't even describe the research I do, because then the IRB will figure out who I am and that I've complained." They're too afraid to speak up because they fear the IRB will limit their future work, which is in fact the accepted way by which IRBs are meant to deal with uncooperative researchers. And it's not just me. A journalist who wrote about IRBs found, in again quotations, everyone he talked to except one, because his complaint had already been in the newspapers. So, except for that one, everyone he talked to requested anonymity because they were afraid. The faculty members wanted anonymity because they were afraid of the IRB, and the IRB's members all wanted anonymity because they were afraid of the federal regulators. Everybody's running scared. Now, why would this be? Well, faculty and students face devastating punishments for nonconformity. If a scholar fails to be cooperative, the IRB will review his or her future work with greater severity. In other words, we don't go into this business for the money. We do it because we want to learn stuff and publish it. And the IRB will take our publication as a sign of lack of cooperation if we can get their permission and follow their rules, and then limit our future publication. Well, no scholar can handle that. Scholars can deal with not enough money. They can't deal with being suppressed. If a scholar compiles data and begins to work on a paper without permission, the IRB can and will send him an email telling him to stop. They'll even tell the IRB member to stop thinking about data. Really, stop thinking about data if their permission is lapsed. The Michigan IRB actually directly states this on its website. If your permission lapses, you are no longer permission to analyze your data. You're told to stop. IRB did this in the 15th century. They weren't even trying this by the 17th century. Galileo was free to analyze all he wanted. Just the publication was a problem. So this is much worse than at least the 17th century version of the Inquisition. If a researcher submits a paper to a journal, the IRB can demand that he withdraw it. And this is something that has been documented. I'm sure it's happened quite frequently, but it's been documented at least at the University of Illinois, at George Washington University, and the University of Pittsburgh. Just to give you an example, at Illinois, an African-American professor submitted a literary piece to the Kenyon Review. Doesn't sound too dangerous to me. The IRB warned him that they'd have the police go after him if he didn't withdraw it. IRBs not only do this, probably at the behest of the government, although I haven't fully documented this, IRBs increasingly compare faculty publications with IRB records. They match them up to ferret out who failed to get permission. And so then after you've published, they can go after you and prevent you from doing your future research. An IRB can even declare a scholar unfit to do future research. Imagine that. A government-sponsored committee declaring you unfit to do any research. So this is the modern licensing system, all four layers of it. As in the past, the government demands licensing, the universities do the government's bidding, the licensors, the IRBs, deny you permission to speak or publish, and the individuals, of course, suffer. 17th century, I thought it was just history, but it's come back to life. It's an historian's dream, I suppose. Okay. There are two basic questions that need to be answered about the licensing. And the first question is the constitutional question. Is this licensing unconstitutional? In particular, does it violate the First Amendment? To begin with, the licensing system is clearly imposed by the force of law, what's sometimes called state action. The federal government imposes IRBs through conditions on its grants, and these conditions can raise complex constitutional issues. But even if you don't think that's the force of law is at least abundantly clear at the state level, in state negligence law and in state IRB statutes. The next question is whether IRB laws regulate speech or merely expressive conduct. Now, this is not the place to parse complicated constitutional doctrine, but just note in passing, if flag-burning porn movies and nude dancing have First Amendment protection, I would hope academic inquiry and publication also do. But we don't have to go down this road, because the IRB laws directly regulate speech. Remember the definition of research? The definition of research is a systematic effort to develop generalizable knowledge. And the laws thus directly impose licensing on attempts to develop publishable generalizations. And of course, in addition, the law directly requires IRBs to license the acquisition of information and to share information. That's what it's all about. The licensing system under IRBs is so unconstitutional that it violates almost every free speech doctrine. I've been thinking as I flew here, can I think of a constitutional doctrine in the First Amendment area, in the free speech area, that isn't violated by the IRB system? I couldn't think of one. Just for example, it's like a smorgasbord of the First Amendment violations. For example, IRB laws have content discrimination. They penalize academic speech, they penalize theoretical speech, they penalize empirical scientific methodology and not other approaches, and of course they penalize sensitive speech. The IRB laws conflict with a doctrine concerning offensive speech, as stated in Cohen versus California, because they authorize IRBs to bar speech that offends community sensibilities. The IRB laws are unconstitutionally vague, because they allow licensing on subjective standards. And they, of course, suffer from overbreadth. They authorize suppression of much talking and publication that will never be harmful. So the IRB laws are thus unconstitutional under many doctrines. But I'd like to focus today on the most serious constitutional problem, licensing, the 17th century problem. The First Amendment's guarantee of freedom of speech in the press is much disputed. There's a lot of controversy about this. But there's one thing that is abundantly clear, about which there's no dispute, which is that the First Amendment barred licensing of speech in the press. Early Americans viewed such licensing as the epitome of tyranny, and they therefore adopted constitutional provisions of freedom of speech in the press, primarily to bar licensing. These provisions do other things, but it was primarily to bar licensing. And of course, the First Amendment leaves room for some regulation of speech, but only after the fact, not beforehand. To understand the unconstitutionality of IRB laws, just imagine an NRB, not an IRB, but an NRB. What's an NRB? A newspaper review board. They don't exist yet, but just imagine it. Imagine that the government required not only universities, but newspapers to establish these review boards. And so an investigative journalist would have to get permission from a newspaper review board before beginning any investigation designed to produce publishable knowledge. Instead of generalizable knowledge, I guess it would be particularizable knowledge if it's for a newspaper. They'd need permission before reading public records, before interviewing, before publishing. The NRB would rewrite her questions, prevent her from causing emotional upset, worry, financial or legal or reputational harm. Why would one read a newspaper if this were done? The NRB would bar publication of the names of persons who might suffer anxiety or adverse consequences as a result of publication. Okay, so this is obviously blatantly unconstitutional. But if it's unconstitutional as to journalists, why not also as to academics? Okay, so much for the constitutional question. It's actually not that difficult. Let's turn to perhaps a more interesting question, the question of harm. On the one hand, the harms caused by research need to be taken into account. On the other hand, there's the harm caused by IRB licensing. And this is important for constitutional analysis, but it's also independently important. Now, in theory, IRBs are necessary to protect human subjects. And certainly there is some harmful research out there. Government medical research has traditionally had some dangerous examples. And some specific experiments, particularly FDA drug trials, sometimes are dangerous. But human subjects research in general has never been shown to be particularly dangerous. To be specific, there is no empirical scientific evidence that overall academic research is distinctively harmful. Nor is there empirical scientific evidence that overall anything is more harmful when done in academic research than when done outside such research. Nor is there any empirical scientific evidence that overall anything done with intent to learn generalizable knowledge or with intent to publish is more harmful than when done for other purposes. Why should anything be more harmful, it's not a surprise, if it's done to publish as opposed to not to publish? So what does this mean? It means that if you're genuinely concerned about harm, what you really need to consider is not the harm to human subjects, but the harm from suppressing knowledge. That's what really kills people. Every year, IRBs censor tens of thousands of research proposals, indeed, probably at least hundreds of thousands research proposals. I've heard suggestions from some people who are very knowledgeable about from the interior of the IRB system that it's as many as 500,000 research proposals reviewed every year. And some of the research that gets abandoned, altered, or forbidden, just perhaps, might have profound effects in saving or improving lives. Imagine out of these thousands, indeed perhaps hundreds of thousands of research proposals, imagine each year that one transformative project got suppressed on account of censorship. If only one such project is lost, even so, the consequences for human life are very sobering. And if one adds up the costs over decades, it's difficult to avoid the conclusion that IRBs cause not merely more harm, but vastly more harm than anything they could possibly prevent, if they prevent any harm at all. The lethal effects came to light 2 years ago, right here in Michigan. Researchers from Johns Hopkins wanted intensive care units in Michigan to adopt very simple procedures. Just how simple? To have doctors wash their hands. I know, that's a tough one. But the experiment was to see what happens if you remind doctors to wash their hands and a few other very simple procedures to see if this would prevent infection from IV lines. The researchers got IRB permission, and they began their research. And it was very, very successful. According to the New York Times, within 3 months, the rate of bloodstream infections from these IV lines fell by 2/3. Over 18 months, the program saved more than 1,500 lives and nearly $200 million. That's just within the research itself. That's not bad. The benefits of publishing the study, of course, were even greater. Between 30 and 62,000 patients every year die from such infections, with costs in the billions. And those numbers, by the way, come straight from the HHS website. So I'm just borrowing their numbers. 30 to 62,000 patients a year die. Now imagine saving the lives of 2/3 of those patients, not to mention all those billions of dollars. But how did the government view it? The government decided that the IRB had not been stringent enough, and it shut down the research. It just ordered them to shut down the research. And incidentally, in a letter explaining why, one of the reasons given is there was an attempt to actually understand what was going on. That was what led the government to do this. Unfortunately, the government acted too late. It was too late to stop the project altogether, and certainly too late for publication. It got published, actually, before the government stopped it, and that's why the government then reacted. But the case is revealing, because it shows how much might have been lost if the IRB had done its work effectively as the government expected it to. That's just one study. Just one. Imagine hundreds of thousands a year. In a society based on freedom of inquiry and publication, the IRB licensing is deadening. It has ruined much scholarship. It has destroyed the lives of scholars. It has undermined graduate education, really quite ruined much graduate education. It has stifled whole areas of learning, and it has impeded the advancement of knowledge with lethal results. Just look around this room and ask yourself, how many of us will have shorter lives as a result of the IRBs? How many of us will suffer from diseases that will not be cured because of IRBs? How many of us will remain handicapped because of the IRBs? This is our licensing system, and it's run by the universities. Now, of course, the licensing system is harmful in ways that actually go beyond these material losses. Most obviously, the licensing affects our relationship to government. How can we know the effect of government policies if academics and students cannot talk to individuals, read about them, publish about them without censorship? How can we have responsible government if academics and students cannot question persons in authority or even ask questions about such persons without censorship? And by the way, I'm not just generalizing here. There are studies that have been stopped, delayed, and ruined simply for asking federal officials questions. And so in these circumstances, we have to ask, how on earth can we preserve our freedom if we have a system of licensing of this sort? And of course, ultimately, the harms go even further than the political costs, and it is to understand these deeper harms that we need the help, remember, of Socrates and Galileo. Academic inquiry will always be in tension with populist and hierarchical anxieties. Socrates studied human nature in a way that seemed to challenge the divinities of the city, and for this the demos punished him. Galileo studied the nature of the universe in a way that seemed to offend the dignity of God, and for this the hierarchy punished him. In our society, the dignity of God obviously has been left by the wayside, but the dignity of human beings has been elevated, and to offend this is to incur the wrath of the demos, or at least the populist wrath of those who claim to speak for the people. So in conclusion, much has changed since the 17th century, but so much is the same. In the 17th century, the Inquisition and the Star Chamber licensed speech in the press, and now the IRBs do it. Censorship is back, and once again the universities implement it. What would Galileo and Socrates say? Well, they might well think that the suppression of inquiry is the most natural tendency in human society. But that doesn't mean they would want us to submit to it. Because they would probably urge that inquiry is a natural tendency of human individuals. Socrates, remember, said, an unexamined life is not worth living, and Galileo took a similar attitude to the universe. No amount of censorship can obscure this truth. First, the licensing imposed by IRB laws is utterly unconstitutional. It is probably the single most systematic and widespread violation of the First Amendment in the nation's history. Second, the licensing is profoundly harmful, both for individuals and the sort of society that is based on individual freedom. None of us need anyone's permission to talk or ask questions. None of us need anyone's permission to read public records. None of us need anyone's permission to keep or analyze data. None of us need anyone's permission to publish information. In the end, though, do not accept what I say and do not accept what the IRBs say. Instead, please exercise your own curiosity, especially about IRBs. Ask questions. Ask forbidden questions. Press for information. Publish your results. Don't get permission first. Just talk and publish without permission. And in all of your inquiries, take Socrates and Galileo as your companions. Socrates died for his freedom. Galileo went to prison for his freedom. All you need to do is stand up for your freedom. And if you ever doubt what's wrong with licensing of speech in the press, just ask Socrates and Galileo. Thank you.
In many cases, you're saying that the supposed harm is just by making uncomfortable inquiries. But as I understand it, and I don't know very much about it, but in the origin of the review boards was that more, shall we say, tangible harms were done by some of the inquiries, psychological harms in some cases, controlled experiments that were discriminatory in nature, say the Tuskegee experiment or the Milken experiment, which might in fact cause deep psychological harms. So it strikes me that that's beyond, shall we say, pure speech, and that something else is at stake. The other question I wonder if you could touch on would be the spending power. I know you addressed this in the in your article, but as I understand, we're all free to do whatever we want as of an academic nature, as long as we fund it ourselves. Now, maybe that's not true. If I suppose if we're my colleague Carl Schneider's shaking his head. Is that because I'm a member of the university and therefore I can't? So, well, anyway, maybe you can address that. To what extent is this simply a use of the spending power?
Right. So, two questions. One, what about more substantive harms, especially physical harms, or the profound psychological harms, not mere worry, and second, unconstitutional conditions. So first, on the harms. Look, government can regulate harms. There's no problem with that. It's just that the First Amendment forbids one method most clearly, which is prior licensing of speech in the press. One can have all sorts of regulation, but licensing of speech in the press is a forbidden method of regulation. Now, of course, if you have real harms, by all means, we should have laws that deal with some of them, right? But it's rather odd that these regulations, although they're justified in terms of harm, don't take aim at harms. They take aim at publication. They leave all sorts of harms untouched and only focus on the harms that involve publication. This is very odd. And most of what IRBs do, of course, is not stop harms, but regulate what you can ask, say, and read, and publish. So if there really were focus on harms, that would be much more interesting. But that's not what's going on here. What we have here are laws that focus on speech in the press and indeed licensing. Now, there were, the Tuskegee study was mentioned, and that's actually very interesting. Tuskegee was a study beginning in the 1930s of syphilis in black men in one county in the South, and was conducted by the government, indeed the Public Health Service. And it's said that this and a bunch of other studies, such as the Willowbrook hepatitis study and the Army studies, show that IRBs are necessary. But let's start by noticing that this is not about a failure of ethical review boards, because at least Tuskegee and Willowbrook had IRB approval. So, IRBs reflect all the prejudices of their society, and the idea that in the 1930s an IRB board was going to stop a study that appears racist is rather improbable, right? The IRB reflects community standards and opinions. That's the whole point. So they're just going to ratify prejudice. So it's not a failure of ethical review. Second, notice these studies that evoke such horror turn out not to be ordinary research. They all have some things in common. And the two key elements are the government and doctors. You put government and doctors together, and they feel empowered in ways that does lead to real harm. And it gets particularly bad when they do their stuff to patients who are wards of government or dependent populations. Then there's an even greater sense of freedom. And, that's Willowbrook, that's Tuskegee, and to some extent the Army studies. So we've got a very specific problem that comes out of the government. And the government, in a sort of odd sense of projection, then said, we have a problem, and licensed other people. So there's no real connection between Tuskegee and what's actually getting regulated here. And then, of course, what happened at Tuskegee is not just about a breach of some research ethics, whatever they are. It was a problem of medical personnel misbehaving towards persons to whom they're giving care. I believe that's called a violation of the Hippocratic Oath. It is a breach of a fiduciary duty at law. That's a very serious problem. And the government actually, in the Belmont report, deliberately understated it. Many people say, what's wrong with Tuskegee? Because the government says it was a breach of research ethics, as if there was a general problem with researchers. But researchers don't owe much to other people. If anything, this should be treated the same as anyone else. So the government, actually in a very dangerous way, understated what happened at Tuskegee to justify IRBs. I don't think there's any connection. Okay, forgive me, I want to say one other thing on the evidence of harm. In fact, the most important article for showing harm in research is Henry Beecher's 1966 article. He identifies 22 dangerously unethical research projects. Guess what? He suppressed the identity of the researchers. Why? Because they were his human subjects. And it's sort of proof the danger of suppressing information. Well, what happens when many years later, half a century later, you find out who those researchers are and what they were doing? Well, of those 22 studies, it turns out 3 were not even American studies. The most lethal turns out to be happening in the Philippines. And that's just not evidence as to what's happening in America and American research. Of the 19 remaining studies, 14 involved, guess, government and doctors. Government doctors studying wards of government. In other words, there is a problem, but it ain't this. It's not research in general. It's government and doctors. Very quickly, as your second question, unconstitutional conditions, yes, it's a profoundly complicated topic. These are, it seems to me, unconstitutional conditions simply because of their extraordinary breadth, that they have and the condition is so disproportionately broad compared to the funding for one scholar, right? But one of the nice things about the government's approach to this is it has many layers of legal force, not just conditions, but also state negligence law, right? So there's at least state action at the state level.
I just wanted to be sure to clarify one thing and then to ask one question. It doesn't matter whether your money comes from the federal government, any other source, or your own pocket. You are subject to all of the rules that Professor Hamburger described. So this is not a question of the federal government saying we don't want our money spent in bad ways. This is a question of the federal government using its funding authority to reach out far beyond its own activities to encompass everybody's activities.
When you say everybody, you mean everybody in the university?
Everybody in the university, yeah. Or a hospital that receives federal money. So my question is this. It's hard to imagine a plainer, simpler, more obvious infringement, indeed eclipse, of academic freedom than a censorship board that says to everybody in the university who does human subject research, you must have our imprimatur, our nihil obstat, before you can publish. Second, there is plainly no doubt that thousands and thousands of people are dead today and are ill today who need not have had research been conducted as the researchers wanted to do it. So it's a machine that plainly ends academic freedom for the people who do this kind of research, and it is machinery that plainly kills thousands of people for reasons that are very hard to identify. Why have universities that purport to be interested in research, to be all about research, and to be interested in human life, never resisted this imposition?
It's a very good question, and I wish I knew the answer. Who knows? One reason, you have an answer, please share it.
Well, institutions by definition are here to maintain the status quo, historically. And that's the answer.
Yeah. It's
baggage that's brought into the institution plays out.
Right, and I don't think, I don't think IRBs intend to do evil. They're not thinking, let's be like the Star Chamber in the Inquisition. That's our role model. It's quite different. There's a desire to do good, and if you think you're doing good, you're not apt to see evil. And the problem with this is that power over freedom of speech in the press is very dangerous if it doesn't reside in each individual. So part of it, I think, can be explained. Yes, the IRBs are reflections of all the prejudices of the society itself. There are other possible explanations. For example, if one studies theology, as I do to some degree, I study religious liberty and theology, one can't help noting that the IRBs rise into prominence just at the time of, as it were, the de-establishment of the social de-establishment of the Protestant church in this country. This isn't just fanciful, by the way. The federal government actually invited large numbers of theologians to help them set the standards for licensing. And even today, in the government documents on this, you're encouraged to have a clergyman on your IRB. There are very interesting power moves going on here. But that's a deeper topic than perhaps I'm capable of pursuing. And then last but not least, rather soberingly, I think constitutional lawyers can be blamed. How would that be? Because scholars of freedom of the press, freedom of speech in the press in the last century, have been very interested in 20th century threats, which meant post-publication restraints and injunctions. And to justify this, they disparaged the danger from licensing. The standard 20th century move on licensing is, that was just the initial reason for the First Amendment, but that doesn't really matter anymore, and it's not particularly dangerous. What's happening today is particularly dangerous. So it was said in the 20s. And we now have bought into the constitutional law of the 1920s and 50s, and that dominates casebooks today. Oddly enough, when you remove and disparage the barrier to past threats, they come alive again. And in fact, if you go through government documents revealing the legal advice they were getting, I haven't gotten all of them, but I've gotten some of them, they make quite explicit, the Supreme Court has allowed us to do this now, so we don't have to worry. So I think the development of constitutional law has, amongst academics, has actually created an opening for licensing again. It's really rather dismaying thought about modern constitutional law, and particularly the First Amendment and how it's taught.
The University of Michigan Senate's annual Davis Markert Nickerson Lecture on Academic and Intellectual Freedom is supported in part by contributions from the public to the Academic Freedom Lecture Fund. Checks should be made payable to AFLF and mailed to P.O. Box 4152, Ann Arbor, Michigan 48106-4152. Alternatively, checks may be made payable to the University of Michigan AFLF and mailed to the same address. Such contributions will be invested in a University of Michigan account entitled Academic Freedom Lecture Fund, which is under the joint stewardship of both the University of Michigan Senate Advisory Committee on University Affairs and the Board of Directors of the Academic Freedom Lecture Fund, and might qualify for both Michigan as well as federal income tax deductions. Individuals who contribute become members of the AFLF and will receive information about activities sponsored by the fund. AFLF is a Section 501c3 nonprofit organization. All contributions to it are tax-deductible under IRS regulations.